On this auspicious day, I, Niyati, welcome you to the second day of International Conference on Ecosophy, Art and Peace, organized by Gandhian Center for Philosophical Arts and Sciences. Today, we have a special session by Professor Yan Manu Chakravarti on the cosmos and human consciousness, metaphysical explorations in cinema. Professor Yan Manu Chakravarti cannot be bound to one fixed structure. He is an academician, feminist, critic, and more than anything, he is someone who takes his students along with him to greater heights. Introducing him in a little span of time is difficult, but I will try to keep it short. Professor Yan Manu Chakravarti is a renowned cultural theorist. He is a pioneer in the field of cinema, criticism, literature, music, and philosophy. He is a recipient of many awards: Indian Government Swarna Kamal Award, President's Gold Medal, Karnataka Sahitya Academy Award, VM Inamdar Award, to name a few. He has authored and edited many books, including U.R. Anantamurthy's Omnibus, Hunt, Bangle and Chameleon, Rujuvaatu, Cultural Realism, a book on renowned filmmaker Girish Kasravalli's film, Moving Images, Multiple Realities, Culture and Creativity, etc. He headed the Department of English in NMKRV College for Women in Bengaluru, and he has been a visiting professor in different universities. Professor Manu Chakravarti is not just an addition to an institution, he himself is an institution. I welcome you, sir.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Niyati, and thank you, Vardesh. Before I deal with the films I have in mind, in fact, I have just 3 films in mind. There's a whole tradition of cinema in the Western context that deals with these issues of the universe, the cosmos, and human consciousness. One can't go into all that, but I think I will deal with 3 major texts. I'll come to that later. But I think it's absolutely necessary to consider some very serious philosophical reflections on science, the nature of science, the nature of reality, and the nature, small n, the nature of nature itself, capital N, the idea of truth. In fact, historians of science, and more importantly, philosophers and philosophers of science. These are philosophical questions which are part of the Western philosophical tradition, but also part of a whole area of philosophy of science that have made inquiries into these. And I will consider only 2 distinguished philosophers in this presentation, Martin Heidegger and Michael Polanyi. In fact, Heidegger, in one of his major works, and especially the essay titled The Question Concerning Technology, argues that the nature of modern science, technology-aided science, is a science of, he uses these German words, but translated into English. He says the tendency is to indulge in entrapment, to entrap, and enframement, by which he means scientific theories of a certain kind try to entrap and enframe nature to fit into their theories. And Heidegger argues the Greeks were very open about it. In fact, when they used theoria, in fact, the Greeks were very open, very uncertain, and they left the understanding of nature, they left it as an indeterminate thing. In fact, a modern scientist and Nobel Prize winner like Richard Feynman echoes this, saying that the Greeks were open, the Greeks were expansive. So for Heidegger, nature is something that is, again, these are German words translated into English, revealing. That nature is a revelation, which also carries the meaning that it is to think what has not been thought. So to indulge in thought which has no precedence at a certain level. And therefore he talks of to discover what has been uncovered. And the whole struggle should be, Heidegger argues, to look for connections among fragments and totalities. Because he says nature has the tendency to present itself in many realms and it functions in those realms. And therefore, for Heidegger, it's this degree of openness, it's this element of revelation that we must really come to terms with when we deal with what we could call nature, truth, reality, cosmos, universe. In fact, the other philosopher of science who was also a practitioner of science, Michael Polanyi, he has a whole book called Knowing and Being. In fact, Polanyi deals with the problems with science within the framework of science and argues, I quote Polanyi, that scientific rationalism served humanity as long as it was moving towards its false ideals from a great distance. But this could not last. Eventually, the truth-bearing power of its absurd ideals was bound to be spent and its stark absurdity to assert itself. Polanyi continues, scientific rationalism beyond a point became obscurantism, and that has pervaded our culture and now distorts even science itself by imposing on it false ideals of exactitude, unquote. In fact, there are two very, very significant essays in the book called The Two Cultures and the Growth of Science in Society, all in the 1960s. So Polanyi talks of how certain things cannot be demonstrated or proved, but only demand what he calls a tacit understanding. In fact, there's a whole chapter on tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is to be open to nature through intuition, cognition, leading to perception, and these are to be integrated with what we could call exact knowledge, but both are indeterminate. So cognition, perception are indeterminate, and the so-called exact knowledge, scientific knowledge, empirical knowledge is also indeterminate. So Polanyi's argument is that we cannot be definite, we cannot be sure, we cannot be wholly deterministic about these things. See, these are philosophical ideas within the traditions of philosophy and philosophy of science. In fact, the cinematic tradition has concerned itself with all these things in a very major way. And I turn to three films here. One is the 1968 film by Stanley Kubrick. At one level, a futuristic film. You can call it science fiction, but it's not really so. 2001, A Space Odyssey. And Andrei Tarkovsky's Solaris. Kubrick made his film in 1968. Tarkovsky made Solaris in 1971. You see, these are films that deal with issues of outer space. The stars, the galaxies, the constellations, and the space stations sent up by human beings, space vehicles, and correlates them with space-time structure. So one is space-time, what it is to deal with space and time in the outer space, to correlate it with space and time as we understand it on Earth. So the films move from geographical territories, our Earth, our spatio temporal realities to the dimensions of space. The third film that I'm going to examine is the Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa's. The title of the film is Darsu Uzala, made in 1975. But you see, as a contrast, I use Darsu Uzala because this film is totally grounded in this world of ours, rooted in places at a time. If the first three films are about what I characterize as, now I discuss them under conceptual heads. 2001, A Space Odyssey and Solaris are films that deal with what I would characterize as the metaphysics of knowledge, of epistemology, which would mean dealing with questions of nature with a sense of wonder, mystery, seeking, understanding. While Darsi Uzala by Kurosawa is what I would describe as the metaphysics of ethics. That is of gratitude, kindness, compassion, harmony, and to approach nature with these values. But what is remarkably common to all these three films is that they eventually correlate all these inquiries with very, very interesting and not at all surprising for me that they correlate all their explorations with the spiritual quality of love at human, spiritual, and cosmic levels. And therefore, when they deal with human consciousness, they deal with epistemological questions, philosophical questions, and questions of ethics. So with these in mind, I think we should turn to this question of human consciousness. What do we exactly mean when we talk of human consciousness? What do we mean when we deal with the cosmos, universe, space, time? And basic to my argument in this presentation is that there are no definite stances, conclusive positions. Eventually, we are left in a state of mystery, a state of wonder. You see, the film 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968, and when Kubrick called it 2001, at one level, it's a journey into the future. So it's futuristic in that sense. But Stanley Kubrick's sense of human evolution is such that 2001 in 68 goes back to the prehistoric phase. In fact, you can see certain anthropological, sociological elements, cultural elements in the film, especially the first two sections of the film. So you can also treat this so-called futuristic film as a certain kind of visual history of human evolution. And therefore, you see, one cannot approach this film as a film that is simplistic, that is linear in its structure. It's not at all structured. To talk of 2001 is to go back to the prehistoric past, to go back to the earth, the prehistoric earth. And the film opens with magnificent visual images. As I talk about these things, I'm only sad that we cannot show clippings of those magnificent visual frames. The film begins with, in a certain stage, even the pre-ape condition, much before the arrival of the apes. So what are we to make of this earth, which is nothing but pure light, pure darkness, pure silence? The first images of the film are all about light, darkness, and silence, and through extraordinary breathtaking visuals. All that we see are rocks, land, water, absolute wilderness. Why does so-called futuristic film begin at this stage of Earth? Because Kubrick, again, now comes to this human question. What are we to make birth of this are turned to images, context. Genesis, God said, let there be light. God said, let there be life. Today, now as Kubrick made in 1968 and as we reflect on that in 2021, this inanimate world, this world of wilderness where you do not have anything but light, silence, and darkness. The questions that Kubrick wants us to engage with are questions about how did this world come into existence? Big Bang or God created? What do we make of this? How is human consciousness today able to look upon all these things? What explanations do we have to offer? And therefore, if you want to give it a scientific reading, the film opens itself up to that. If you want to move into very mystical, religious, spiritual explanations, the film does not prevent it. So the first engagement is with an absolutely inanimate world where you cannot talk of the manifest consciousness, but it's up to us to open our consciousness to this. Kubrick calls the second section the dawn of man. But man is not the arrival of the human being. It's the world of wild beasts, of predators. And you notice these are all images of wild, untamed nature. And into this wilderness through the apes. So there is also a certain kind of an invocation of Darwin here. Because you also see remnants of animals, prehistoric animals, beasts that have not been able to adapt. You must only look at those images, skulls, bones of gigantic creatures. And it's in this context that Kubrick suggests a certain kind of birth of consciousness through the apes. The apes that have a sense of the self, that have a sense of the world, that have a sense of nature. The second section of Kubrick's film is all about territorial fights. Now, this is the consciousness of survival. When the apes recognize land, territory, and begin to form groups. In fact, anthropologists talk of kinship at very complex levels, of the kind of recognition of territory, of the kind of possession of land and water, struggle for the fittest. And thus begins the evolution of man through the apes. And that evolutionary phase of human history is through conflict, territorial fights. It is for this reason that Kubrick also uses the music of Richard Strauss, borrowing from Nietzsche, Thus Spake Zarathustra. The film is punctuated by different layers of musical schemes. And as Kubrick talks of territorial fights, territorial struggles, the dawn of the man through the apes, is also talking of a certain kind of dawn of consciousness. The film's question is, can we, as so-called modern human beings, talk of our consciousness, human consciousness, unrelated to this totally inanimate world, totally unrelated to that area, space, time of apes. And if you try to understand it through Darwin's Origin of Species, isn't there a certain kind of kinship? As I have been mentioning, no definitive answer, no conclusive position. And that's the philosophical inquiry of a film like 2001: A Space Odyssey. So when we talk of our consciousness, when we deal with human consciousness, the basic question that emerges out of all these frames, the first two frames, as I would like to call it, is about understanding, determining, trying to come to terms with human consciousness with the basic question, Are we to understand our consciousness in this so-called modern world without looking at all those traces of the past? And we seem to carry all those traces. It's at this juncture that the film makes a tremendous leap, and images of an ape playing with bones, skulls. There is one particular ape that's playing with a long bone, hits it into the ground. And as the bone is let loose into the air, the ape throws into the air. There's a certain kind of magnificent visual transformation. Because as a fictional filmmaker, Kubrick is talking of the kinds of metamorphoses that have taken place. The ape throws that huge bone into the air, which transforms itself into a space vehicle, into a space station. The question, therefore, is when did the transitions take place? When did transformations take place between the ape and the modern human being? What were the links? Can we talk of very scientific, rationally determined links? When do leaps take place? In fact, you may be able to offer a very scientific, logical, rational explanation. But I think in a work of art, in a creative work, the greater focus, the greater interest is on looking at missing links. Throughout the film, a certain kind of metaphor, and these are metaphors that we must come to terms with when we deal with such films. All of a sudden, a huge black tablet appears out of nowhere. Kubrick is possibly suggesting that this slab, dark black slab, this tablet is perhaps the mysterious link. And we must always, without being very definitive, we must always look for those missing links and try to arrive at some kind of a holistic understanding to the extent possible as to can human consciousness be specifically determined. Therefore, you will see that the transition phase in 2000 Space Odyssey. And you see, this is where you see what I would like to argue is that when we journey into space with the massive advent of technology, space vehicles, space stations, space explorations, it is technology that comes into existence. Technology based on certain scientific premises, calculations. But again, to go back to Heidegger, what Heidegger says is, if you understand technology as a tool, techne is a certain kind of skill. The space vehicle, measurements that scientists carry, cosmonauts, astronauts carry, they're all part of technology. But Heidegger uses a word called techne, T-E-C-H-N-E. And this is what Stanley Kubrick does. The use of technology as poetry would use, techne means skills. Technology is a kind of skill, but techne goes with logos, knowledge, which means technology must be understood as an instrument that brings a certain kind of awareness, a certain kind of consciousness. So for Kubrick, even as he relies on marvelous use of technology, spaceships, space station, instruments, but the question that a film, that a creative work like 2001, A Space Odyssey asks is, through this technology, as Heidegger argues, what is the new kind of logos, knowledge that we acquire? Are we content with using technology only in a limited manner, in a reductive manner? For Heidegger, technology is also a skill that we use to open up our awareness, consciousness. The enormous use of technology in 2001, A Space Odyssey, is to say that technology, techne, is something through which we gain new awareness, a certain kind of consciousness. And in that sense, techne is a revelation. It is not an end in itself. So even the use of technology is to create greater areas, spaces of awareness, because whatever the sophisticated level of technology, this is the vision of the film. Human consciousness is still incomplete. Human consciousness still has its multiple dark spaces, and therefore the advent of sophisticated technology does not mean the arrival of a certain kind of total knowledge. The darker areas are much more than the areas of light and understanding. When you move towards this, I can go on and on, but I will cut it short because I have to move to the other films and we are already 20 minutes past. This is where you see Heidegger talks of technology also as a crippling instrument. And here is Kubrick, who brings in to the film the latest generation of computers. This is a metaphor. In fact, in the film, there's a computer, it's called HAL, H-A-L, 9000. The most advanced computer, totally infallible, incapable of committing a single mistake. Look at how a computer figures as a metaphor in Stanley Kubrick's film. This infallible computer commits a mistake. There is a major error in outer space, and I would like you all to recognize these as metaphorical expressions of a creative work. So a fictional film deals with philosophical questions, with abstract questions of what is infallible. Is there anything like knowledge that is perfect, without errors, without chinks, without defects? So there is one astronaut who wants to defuse this computer, to make it incapable of functioning because it's committing errors and it could lead to disasters. It is here that Kubrick deals with the question of ethics of advanced technology. Just a bit of the plot of the film. When, as these two astronauts are discussing the possibility of defusing, making the computer non-functional, dysfunctional, the computer lip reads, understands the motives of these two astronauts, and makes it very sure that one of them has to be eliminated. So it throws one astronaut into outer space for him never to return. What is Kubrick suggesting? In fact, if you understand the metaphor, Kubrick is only suggesting that the monstrosity of a totally technical world, sophisticated technological world, is perhaps nothing but an extension of the evil of human beings. So all the computer seems to include in itself, and this is the metaphorical position, that whatever technology reveals, human beings can create, can shape such a dehumanized, decadent, dehumanizing technological world that human beings may be trapped, may become the victims of their own creation. And therefore, the potential of evil, you see, this is the nature of technology, such advanced, dehumanized technology, technology without feeling, without human feelings, without empathy, without compassion. I want to make it very clear, this is not a simplistic understanding of technology. But the metaphor in the film is that such a kind of technology, surveillance, panopticon, that we have created, this is the nature of scientific fictional films. that they extrapolate from technology and begin to understand, recognize technology as the accumulated hidden evil of the human mind, of human consciousness. These are ethical questions. That is why the metaphysics of knowledge leads to the metaphysics of ethics. These are questions, no great answers given in the film. Are we to be content with such an advanced technological age that's dehumanized and that dehumanizes us? Or are we to make our journeys back into the past? Which is why you see 2001 A Space Odyssey creates a certain kind of a lapse of time. The ending of the film is there is the other astronaut, Dave, who totally defuses, makes the computer dysfunctional. But look at the kind of cyclical chronology that the film unfolds before us. Dave moves, and there are magnificent images of old age of the human being tying up with the prehistoric world, going back to the early ages of the evolution of the earth, contrasted with a child in a womb and the umbilical cord. So these are images of middle age, old age, the unborn child, suggesting the future. So what are we journeying into? Are we journeying into the future? From the future, are we going back to the past? From the past, are we coming to the present? Can we talk of any definite separation between the past, the present, and the future? So the suggestion in the film is perhaps the birth of a new age through the child in the womb, which is a journey through technology from the past through the present into a future where we do not succumb, we do not become the victims of our own monstrous creations. And therefore, the birth of a new kind of human civilization. The film is futuristic, not just in the scientific sense. The film is futuristic in this philosophical sense. Are we not then to visualize, to imagine a world where you cannot do away with technology, but where you create a new world based on compassion, on love, on spiritual solidarity? When do we create that world? So in the mid-60s, here is Kubrick imagining a world 50 years hence, and we are already 20 years past 2001. As to deal with science, technology, human consciousness, the possibilities of awareness, and the genesis of a new kind of human civilization based on really spiritual qualities of compassion and love. And in this sense, 2001 A Space Odyssey, it's a journey into the future, but no journey into the future is possible without a full understanding of the journeys we have made, the multiple plural journeys we have made from the prehistoric past to the recent past to the present. Now, this is the cyclical philosophical vision of a film like 2001 A Space Odyssey. Tarkovsky's Solaris. Tarkovsky's Solaris is not a visual treat. It is not an aesthetic delight as 2001 A Space Odyssey is. In fact, this is a rigorous philosophical examination of the very spirit of nature. In fact, it's based on a novel by Stanislaw Lem. But what is important for Tarkovsky is to understand the constructions of science. There are two major issues for Tarkovsky. I will deal with these two major issues. One is, what is scientific inquiry? What is objective scientific knowledge? How do we understand the nature of science itself? are there very strict, specific rules that govern scientific inquiry? Or is science itself an area of knowledge, an area of understanding, an area of seeking that should keep itself open to unexpected possibilities of awareness? Can science throw itself open to, and Tarkovsky suggests that it should not be governed, bound by very, very definite, quantifiable principles? The first question that Tarkovsky deals with is because there were two things that happened in Russia. And Tarkovsky constructs his film out of these two examples. I will give those two examples now. One was what was called the Velikovsky experiment. Velikovsky was a scientist who made certain predictions about Venus. The first inquiry of Solaris, and that's why I regard Solaris also as a political film. The entire scientific administration dismissed Velikovsky because Velikovsky seemed to make scientific predictions based on unreliable mythical evidence, drawing from mythical constructions also. But you see, when he was ridiculed and a group of astronomers dismissed Velikovsky's theory, this was in the 1950s. But again, Polanyi shows this. When in 1963, February, you see, actual scientific experiments are taken up by Tarkovsky to arrive at some other position in his creative work. What that position is, I will come to later. But you see, when the American space explorer Mariner 2, when it journeyed into outer space, the data sent by Mariner 2, this was in February 1963. Every data sent by Mariner 2 only seemed to underline the veracity of Velikovsky's theories. In fact, when Velikovsky in the 1950s, when he even asked the Harvard Observatory to test his hypothesis. In fact, Velikovsky writes to the Harvard laboratory and asks them to verify his predictions. They were all rejected. So the power of scientific administration, the power of a scientific regulatory body, which dismisses a certain kind of human consciousness because it is not verifiable. The moment a certain hypothesis is made, it may not be verifiable. But 20 years later, 15 years later, as it happened when the American space explorer made its journey, each of Velikovsky's predictions came true. They were vindicated. And therefore, you see, the Tarkovsky uses this. And the only question that is asked, no emphatic, definitive answer, is the human mind, with all its technology, capable of totally explaining the phenomena, the abundant, infinite phenomena of space of the universe? You see, as a creative work, the basis of a creative work is to throw up questions, interrogate without coming to very irritable conclusions. So what do you do with certain predictions that appear to be unscientific, that come to be ridiculed at a certain stage, but they come true? What do you do with this? How do you explain this? So how do you explain phenomena? Do we have a perfect scientific measure to explain all phenomena? There was another scientific experiment that took place in Soviet Russia. This was during the Stalinist period. Now, I give these two examples from actual scientific history of the Soviet Union only to show that Solaris is a film that questions the authority of scientific bodies, the monstrous dictatorial authority of scientific bodies that arrogate unto themselves all knowledge, all correct, precise knowledge. In fact, Tarkovsky does not do anything more. The only question that Tarkovsky is interested in asking is, does the human mind have infinite resources to truly open up the dark spaces, the dark matter of that mysterious entity called space, cosmos, the universe? In fact, this took place in the field of agriculture. And this is the famous Trofim Lysenko affair. Lysenko used a process called vernalization. I will not go too much into the details. That is to change the genetic structure of plants, freeze them so that the genetic structure will change, and the next generation, the next race of that species will adapt itself to very harsh climatic conditions. The scientific body approved of it, vernalization. But it proved to be a great agrarian disaster for Russia. And the study of genetic structures itself was impeded by this Lysenko affair. For Tarkovsky, these scientific experiments serve to underline this truth that we need to turn to what Polanyi would call perhaps the most expansive areas of tacit understanding, where actual bodies of knowledge which are indeterminate are integrated with cognition, the cognitive elements. And therefore, the only point that Tarkovsky makes as a creative artist would do is to stress, underline this basic truth that the unfathomable, inscrutable dimensions of the universe, of the cosmos, those unfathomable, inscrutable elements are such that the human consciousness constantly needs to evolve in infinite ways, and not through merely measured, quantified, statistical or empirical modes, reductive modes. And therefore, we must turn to these films, Solaris and 2001: A Space Odyssey, as visions of nature, because the visions of nature come from an understanding that the inanimate world is not what we think it is, that there are multiple unseen, unknown, inscrutable manifestations. And therefore, for Tarkovsky, the notion of reality, is it to be open only to scientific inquiry, or is it to be regarded as part of a great metaphysical inquiry? Can we talk of, much as we respect, admire, and acknowledge science as a body of knowledge, aren't there questions, and these are questions asked, not even answered, isn't there a need to integrate science with metaphysics, science with the possibilities of a new form of consciousness, awareness, emerging out of nowhere under inexplicable circumstances? So as a filmmaker, much as he includes the infinite possibilities of science, Tarkovsky does not become reductive, nor does he become affirmative, emphatic in a singular sense. Most interesting is, with all his very, very deep religious conviction, Tarkovsky does not even adopt the method of theology. But his only concern is with the use of technology to create destruction, his major concern is with the principle of anthropocene, which I think is an ethical position. That human intervention, as it has caused enormous damage to the nature of the universe, to the substance that we recognize as the universe. So, for Tarkovsky, the questions are, is he fictionalizing science? To an extent, he is fictionalizing science. Or is he dealing with processes of mental reality? Can we totally rule out mental reality, mental constructs as possible ways of understanding the universe? I will repeat it again. Can we not acknowledge the value of mental constructions, mental realities, as possible levels of understanding of nature, of the mysteries of nature? This again, you will recognize, is something so important that the film, without a simplistic reductionist denial of science and technology, raises science and technology to the level of metaphysics. The only point being, as a creative work, it says, don't we need to transcend certain quantifiable dimensions of what we recognize as science and technology? In this sense, this is the reason why I began by invoking the writings of Heidegger and Polanyi. And therefore, the whole struggle is to extend the ranges of human consciousness, to begin to see that the matrix that we have created, the matrices that we have created are inadequate. Not that we need to throw them away, not that we need to reject, but the only position is to recognize the inadequacy of all that we have with us as knowledge, as science, as technology, just to recognize the infinite possibilities of the universe, of the cosmos. For the simple reason, and as Tarkovsky was a witness to the disasters of his age, of his period, the whole film ends with this poetic vision. And that's why what could be regarded as a scientific fiction film that deals with science, scientific fiction, fictionalization of science, is a film that ends with this question. It's almost like a philosophical question. Don't we then, after all this, need to learn the value of shame for what we have done, for the disasters we have created? And isn't it time that we began to cultivate feelings of empathy, compassion, love, with two basic principles, justice and equality? Now, this is the poetic vision. If Kubrick does it through the unborn child, so the journey into the future is through the unborn child, the child in the fetus. For Tarkovsky, it is through a sense of shame, the burden, the guilt that we must carry for all the disasters we have created, Anthropocene. But it's not a dismal ending. It's not a dark ending. But then to say, out of this sense of shame, we must give birth to virtues like love, compassion. And therefore, you see, much as these two films deal with these possibilities of understanding, the possibilities of understanding nature, the cosmos, the universe through science, as creative works, as philosophical inquiries, the common vision of these two films is to say, it is perhaps time that we recognized the value of metaphysical understanding, and which only broadens the horizon, the frontiers of scientific inquiry. So, from the metaphysics of knowledge, we move to the metaphysics of ethics through compassion, through empathy, through love. In 1975, Kurosawa made Darsu Uzala. I will try to be as brief as possible. In fact, Darsu Uzala creates two kinds of words, as it were. I will have to trace the plot a bit for those who may not have seen the film. Darsu Uzala is an old man, but a child of nature. Again, Kurosawa situates this old man, the child of nature, in two worlds. One is the world of nature, the first part of it being the green, verdant forests, thick forests, thick vegetation. And here it is Darsu Uzala who shows how to survive in a world which is hostile at one level, in a world that you are not used to, but a world you're trying to explore. So in the first world, in the first context, in fact, it is this whole spirit of survival through the spirit of what we could call conviviality. The first part of the film is about the understanding of conviviality. How does one exist in nature? How does one use nature, use in the utilitarian sense, in a spirit of harmony without destroying nature? What is the organic symbiotic relationship between the human being, even in the modern world, and nature? What are the lessons we need to draw? So even if you are part of a hunting race, in fact, this is what Darsu Uzala says, to hunt, to plunder, to loot without survival being the basis, it is unethical and it is sinful. If you hunt as a primitive man, as a primitive human being, you should hunt as animals would. And it's only the principle of survival. It is not to loot, it is not to plunder. That question is asked because Darsu Uzala is surrounded by hunters who plunder, who loot, who kill for fun out of perversity. And that seems to be the logic of a certain kind of civilization which has no sense of its location, ethical location in nature, in the universe. So Darsu Uzala for Kurosawa, Darsu Uzala represents a certain kind of primeval, a certain kind of primordial consciousness. But because this primordial consciousness is a human being, there's a certain ethical basis, an ethical grounding, which he does not violate. If Darsu Uzala kills, if Darsu hunts, it's only as an animal would for food, for survival. But complementing all these is this understanding that there are others to follow, that there is a sense of the future, that nature does not belong to you, that you don't own nature, that nature is part of a common human heritage, and to tamper with nature, to hunt, to loot, to plunder without a sense of ethics is the most sinful act that any human being can commit. So the questions of existence in nature, the existential question, the point being that existential questions are determined by the nature of wisdom that we carry. In fact, for Kurosawa, the major question is, in fact, I would argue that the whole film is about the questioning of human attitudes, human motives in the context of a natural scheme, in the context of nature, which has been rendered defenseless, which has been rendered incapable of defending itself. That is, we have constructed a modern civilization where we do not seem to feel the need to raise certain ethical questions. And you see, this is where, at a very conscious level, the film attacks the kind of anthropocentrism, man at the center of nature, man at the center of the universe, where everything rests only to serve man's needs and greeds. Can there be a civilization? Now, I think this is the central point of Kurosawa's inquiry in the film. Can we build a civilization? Can we be content with a civilization? However, we talk of advancing scientific, rational civilization, whatever terminology we use, can there be a sense of the human being, not just civilization? Can there be a sense of the human self? Can we talk of a certain kind of human consciousness that is ethically neutral? Can we talk of ethical neutrality and begin to see that the human self can arrogate to itself the primary position in nature? And therefore, you see, the contrapuntal, there are many kinds of contrapuntal readings possible when we come to the film. The counterpoint to Darsu Uzala, there's a very important counterpoint, and I'm only sorry I can't deal with this at length because I don't know how many of you have watched. Darsu Uzala, in relation to a plundering civilization, has a counterpoint in the form of Arseniev. There's a character called Arseniev who bridges the gap. You see, this is the vision of the film. If on one hand you have a child of nature, if on the other you have a plundering civilization, the most important counterpoint is Arseniev, the character who belongs to the modern civilization, who belongs to this plundering civilization, civilizing world, but who stands as that witness, a witness of conscience, if you would like to call it, who in the modern world invokes sacred qualities, invokes qualities of love, compassion, forgiveness, survival, and who really begins to point to us the central vision of the film, that we exist in nature, that we need to exist in nature, but without letting an ethically neutral consciousness overpower us. And therefore, Arseniev in the film is a witness to Darsu Uzala's skills. A representative of a modern civilization comes as a witness who understands, recognizes, worships these primordial instincts, the natural instincts of a human being who lives in nature, uses nature, survives in nature without plundering, looting it. In fact, the whole contrast is between the two forms of life, nature as it exists in relation to itself, because nature is silent. Nature is indifferent to the ways of human beings. Nature is indifferent to the ways of human civilization. But if you reverse this statement, the human being tampers with this silent spirit of nature. The human being affects nature in such a manner that it's not at all possible to reverse these effects, disastrous effects, destructive effects of human civilization. And therefore, if you are to understand this film in certain philosophical categories, the film is about human action, the kinds of human action, and how it affects. So this is not about cause and effect. It's about the ethics of human action or the lack of ethics of human action and the consequences. And that is affect how human action. So from human thought to human ideas to human consciousness to human action, the link between thought, the generation of action through a certain kind of thought, producing a certain kind of effect, how it affects. manifesting, thought manifesting itself in action. So for Kurosawa, I think the whole struggle is to understand, is to come to terms with the genesis of action. Why do human beings act in particular ways? How do we understand the several manifestations of human consciousness? To understand human action is to turn to the origins of action. And what I mean by the origins of action is action to be understood, actions performed to be understood in relation to our ideas, our concepts, notions, our consciousness itself. So there is this relationship between the universe, the cosmos, and human consciousness. Nature is what we think of it. Nature is what we make of it. And this is the symbiotic, organic, biological relationship between nature and human consciousness. And if you wish to rupture it, if you wish to transgress this symbiotic relationship, then we have a different story to tell about human civilization. So are we to sustain a symbiotic, biological, harmonious relationship with nature? Can we still look for possibilities of protecting this? Or are we to transgress further and further and increase these ruptures, these destructive tendencies? Eventually, the metaphysics of knowledge leads to the metaphysics of ethics.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, can we look for some sort of a symbiotic, harmonious relationship with nature, some sort of an alternative civilization, an ecological civilization? So, in fact, the words, I think, should just sink, and we need to think, we need to meditate